My son asked me to babysit every weekend until I learned he was telling everyone I had nothing better to do. For almost 3 years, every Saturday morning started the same way. My son would pull into my driveway just before 8. My 2 grandkids would run to my front door, and I'd wave goodbye as he promised. We'll be back by dinner. I never complained. I loved those children more than anything. Even after retiring, they gave my weeks purpose, and I honestly believed I was helping my family through a busy stage of life. Then one afternoon, while standing in line at the grocery store, I overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for me. A woman I barely knew smiled politely and said, "It's wonderful that your son keeps you busy. He told everyone babysitting is basically your hobby because you don't have much else going on." I smiled back, but inside, something quietly broke. My name is Linda. I'm 67 years old, and before I retired, I spent nearly 35 years working as a school librarian. People imagine retirement as endless freedom, but the truth is much quieter than that. The first few months felt almost exciting. I woke up without an alarm, drank coffee on the back porch, finally read books that had been sitting untouched on my shelves for years, and even joined a gardening club at the community center. For the first time in decades, my calendar belonged entirely to me. Then my son Daniel called one evening. He sounded exhausted. "Mom, can I ask you a favor?" Parents know that tone immediately. It's the voice your child uses when they already feel guilty before asking. Daniel and his wife Rachel both worked full-time. Daniel managed a hardware store while Rachel was a dental hygienist whose schedule changed every week. Their biggest challenge wasn't work itself. It was childcare. Their 2 children, Ethan and Sophie, were 7 and 5 then. Sweet kids. Energetic enough to leave every room looking like a toy store exploded, but they had kind hearts. Daniel explained that weekend childcare had become incredibly expensive. "Would you mind watching them on Saturdays?" he asked. "Just until we get things sorted out." I didn't even hesitate, of course. That first Saturday reminded me why I loved being a mother in the first place. We baked chocolate chip cookies, built blanket forts in the living room, walked to the neighborhood park where Ethan insisted he was finally old enough to beat me at chess. He wasn't. He claimed I cheated anyway. By 6 o'clock, Daniel and Rachel returned looking genuinely grateful. Rachel hugged me before leaving. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Hearing those words felt nice. Not because I needed praise, because everyone likes feeling useful. The following weekend, they asked again. Then the weekend after that. Within a couple of months, Saturdays simply became Grandma Day. I planned activities during the week, museum, visits, picnics, movie afternoons whenever it rained. The children started keeping pajamas at my house because sometimes they stayed later than expected. Bought extra toothbrushes. Tiny slippers waited beside the guest room bed. My home slowly adjusted itself around their presence, and honestly, loved it. Friends occasionally asked whether I missed having weekends free. I always smiled. They won't stay little forever. I meant every word. Looking back now, I realized the problem wasn't babysitting. The problem was that somewhere along the way, helping stopped being appreciated and quietly became expected. The change happened so gradually, I almost missed it. Daniel stopped asking if I was available. Instead, he'd text something like, "Dropping the kids off at 8. Not, "Can you?" Just dropping them off. The first time it happened, I assumed he was rushing. The second time I noticed, by the 5th or 6th time, it had become our normal. Rachel started adding little requests too. "Can you make sure Ethan finishes his homework? Sophie needs a bath before bed." They both have soccer uniforms that need washing. None of those things were unreasonable by themselves, but together, Saturdays slowly became less like spending time with my grandchildren and more like running someone else's household. One Friday afternoon, my friend Carol invited me to a day trip with our gardening club. "We're visiting the botanical gardens next Saturday," she said. "You should come." I almost accepted before remembering. "Oh, I have the kids." Carol smiled kindly. "You always have the kids." I laughed. "I don't mind." She nodded, but before changing the subject, she quietly asked something that stayed with me. "When's the last Saturday you spent doing something you wanted?" I opened my mouth, then realized I couldn't answer. Not because I never wanted to, because I genuinely couldn't remember. Still, I brushed the thought aside. Families help each other. That's what families do. A few weeks later, Daniel called Thursday evening. "Mom, any chance you could keep them overnight too?" I looked at my calendar. I had tickets to a community theater performance I'd been planning to attend for over a month. Actually have plans Saturday night. There was a pause, then Daniel sighed. "Seriously?" His reaction surprised me. "I've already bought the tickets. It's just, Rachel and I finally have a chance to go out with friends." "I understand," I said gently, "but I've had these plans for weeks." Another silence. Finally, he answered, "Fine, we'll figure something out." The call ended. Awkwardly. I spent the rest of the evening wondering if I'd somehow been selfish. The next morning, guilt won. I called him back. "If you still need me, I'll cancel." His relief was immediate. "Really? Thanks, Mom. I knew I could count on you." I canceled my plans. At the time, I told myself it wasn't a big sacrifice. Now I recognize that moment as the beginning of a pattern. Every time my plans conflicted with theirs, mine disappeared. Months passed. Then one Saturday afternoon, Ethan asked an innocent question while we were making grilled cheese sandwiches. "Grandma." "Yes? Why don't you ever go anywhere on weekends?" I smiled. "I'm here with you." He shrugged. "Dad says that's because you don't really have anything else to do." The butter knife stopped moving in my hand. I looked at him carefully. "What did you say?" He didn't notice anything was wrong. He was only 8. He simply repeated what he'd heard. "Dad says you like babysitting because you're bored when we're not." Here, I forced a smile. "Is that what he said?" Ethan nodded. "He told Uncle Mike you're lucky because it gives you something to do." A few minutes later, Sophie ran into the kitchen asking for apple juice, and the conversation ended. But mine didn't. It stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, after Daniel picked up the children, I stood alone in my quiet kitchen replaying Ethan's words over and over. Maybe it was just something said without thinking. Maybe Ethan misunderstood. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. Then 3 days later, I stopped by the grocery store after my doctor's appointment. While reaching for a carton of milk, I heard someone call my name. It was Melissa. She was Rachel's coworker, someone I'd met only twice before. I chatted politely for a minute before she smiled and said something. That made my heart sink. "I think it's wonderful that Daniel keeps you busy every weekend." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She laughed. "He always says babysitting is basically your retirement hobby because you don't really have much else going on." She had no idea what those words did to me. She was simply repeating something she'd been told. I smiled, politely finished paying for my groceries, walked to my car, and for the first time in years, I didn't know whether I was being appreciated or quietly being taken for granted. That night, I opened my calendar and counted something I hadn't noticed before. What I found made me realize this wasn't just about babysitting anymore. It was about how my own son had slowly rewritten my entire life without ever asking me if I agreed. That night, after putting away my groceries, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and carried my planner to the dining room table. Ever since retiring, I'd kept a paper calendar. I liked crossing things off with a pen instead of tapping buttons on a screen. Looking at an entire month on one page made life feel organized. As I flipped through the past year, something caught my attention. Every single Saturday was marked the same way. Daniel and kids, 8 a.m. some Saturdays, had extra notes. Soccer at 10. Finish science project. Wash uniforms, pack extra snacks. I kept turning pages. January, February, March. By the time I reached the current month, I realized I hadn't had a free Saturday in almost 14 months. Not one. I leaned back in my chair, surprised more than anything. How had I never noticed? It wasn't that I'd been forced into it. I'd agreed every single time. But somewhere along the way, my own life had quietly disappeared behind everyone else's schedule. The next morning, Carol called. "Still coming to coffee tomorrow?" I almost forgot, I admitted. "You've been saying that a lot lately." There wasn't any criticism in her voice, just concern. We met at our favorite cafe Tuesday morning, and after a while, I told her about what Melissa had repeated at the grocery store. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stirred her coffee thoughtfully before asking, "Do you think Daniel actually believes that?" "I don't know. Because if he does, that's a bigger problem than him repeating it." I sighed. I keep telling myself Ethan probably misunderstood. Carol looked at me gently. "Children repeat what they hear at home. They don't invent things like that." Her words stayed with me long after we left the cafe. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to my conversations with Daniel. It wasn't difficult to notice the pattern once I stopped making excuses for it. Every phone call started with a request. "Can you pick Ethan up from soccer Friday? Rachel has a dentist appointment. Can you take Sophie for a few hours? We're running behind. Can you make dinner for the kids?" Not once did he ask what I already had planned. Not once. The following Friday, my gardening club announced they were organizing a weekend trip to a historic flower festival about 2 hours away. Carol immediately looked at me. "You should come." I smiled. "Automatically. I've got the kids." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked quietly, "Have you even checked?" That question lingered in my mind all afternoon. For the first time in years, instead of assuming I wasn't available, I decided to ask Daniel. When he called that evening, I said, "I might have plans next Saturday. Could you make other arrangements for the kids just this once?" The silence on the other end lasted longer than I expected. Finally, he said, "Seriously?" The exact same word he'd used months earlier. "I haven't seen my gardening friends outside the community center in almost a year. I thought Saturdays were your free day." "They are," I replied calmly, which is exactly why I was hoping to use one. He let out a frustrated sigh. "Mom, finding childcare on weekends isn't easy. I understand." "So, you're saying no?" "I'm asking if you can arrange something for one weekend." Another pause. Then he said something that surprised me. "I just figured this wasn't a big deal for you." Not thank you for everything you've done. Not I understand. Just I figured this wasn't a big deal for you. After hanging up, I sat quietly on my porch watching the sun go down. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I felt invisible. A few hours later, Rachel called. That alone was unusual. She usually texted. "Hi, Linda," she said pleasantly. "Daniel mentioned you're busy next weekend. I have a day trip planned." "I know. I was wondering if maybe you could leave a little later. The bus leaves at 8. "Oh." Another brief silence. "Well, maybe next time." The conversation ended politely, but I noticed something. Neither of them had asked about the event. Neither asked where I was going. Neither asked if I was excited. The trip itself didn't seem to matter, only the inconvenience it created for them. Saturday morning arrived at exactly 7:55. I heard a car pull into my driveway. Confused, I looked through the front window. Daniel's SUV. I frowned. I'd already told him I wasn't available. Before I could reach the door, the children were already climbing out of the back seat. Daniel walked toward the porch carrying Sophie's backpack. "Morning." I opened the door but stayed in the doorway. "I thought we talked about today." "We did." He smiled like everything was perfectly normal. "I found a solution." "What solution?" "You can take the kids with you." I blinked. "The flower festival? They'll love flowers." I stared at him, honestly wondering if he was joking. "It's a bus trip for retirees. They're good kids." "Daniel," he interrupted me before I could finish. "They'll entertain themselves." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I said quietly, "No." His smile faded. "What?" "I'm not taking 2 children on a bus full of retirees during an all-day gardening event. They'll be fine." "That's not the point." His expression hardened. "So, you're really choosing flowers over your grandkids?" The words stung more than I expected. "I see them every weekend. They adore spending time with you." "And I adore spending time with them." I kept my voice calm. "But today is one day that belongs to me." Daniel looked genuinely offended. "I can't believe this." Neither could I. Because for the first time, I realized we weren't having a conversation about childcare. We were having a conversation about entitlement. Before either of us could say another word, Ethan stepped onto the porch holding his small backpack. He looked back and forth between us. "Dad." Daniel immediately softened his expression. "It's okay, buddy." But children notice far more than adults give them credit for. Ethan quietly asked, "Did Grandma do something wrong?" The question hit me like a punch. I knelt beside him and smiled. "No, sweetheart." "Then why are you both upset?" I looked at Daniel. He looked away first. Without another argument, he loaded both children back into the SUV. Before closing the driver's door, he turned toward me one last time. "I honestly thought you'd be happy to help." Then he drove away. I stood in my driveway long after the car disappeared. Not because I was questioning my decision, because for the first time, saying no had made me realize just how uncomfortable my son was hearing it. I still went to the flower festival that day. I smiled for pictures, bought a few plants, laughed with Carol, but every so often, my mind drifted back to Daniel's words. "I thought you'd be happy to help." Helping had never been the problem. Being treated as though my own life didn't exist was. The following Monday, I received an unexpected phone call from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. It was my younger brother, Mike. After a few minutes of casual conversation, he hesitated before saying something that made my stomach tighten. "Linda, can I ask you something without you getting upset?" "Of course." He took a deep breath. "Has Daniel always been telling people that you don't really have friends anymore? Or is that something new?" My brother repeated a conversation he'd had with Daniel at a family barbecue months earlier. By the time he finished, I realized my son hadn't just been taking my weekends for granted. He'd been quietly changing the way the entire family saw me. My brother Mike wasn't the kind of person who called just to gossip. If anything, he usually stayed out of family disagreements. So the hesitation in his voice immediately caught my attention. "What do you mean?" I asked. Mike sighed. "I almost didn't bring this up because I figured it wasn't my place. Please just tell me." There was a long pause before he continued. "Last summer, Daniel and I were talking at Jason's barbecue. I asked why you never came fishing with us anymore. I didn't know you were still going." His voice became quieter. "That's because Daniel said you weren't interested." I frowned. "I was never invited." "I know that now." I leaned back in my chair, already feeling my stomach tighten. "What else did he say?" Mike hesitated again. "He laughed and said retirement had made you pretty isolated. He told everyone babysitting the kids gave you something to do because you didn't really have friends anymore." For several seconds, I couldn't answer. Not because I was shocked, because suddenly so many little moments over the last 2 years finally made sense. People had stopped inviting me places. Neighbors assumed I was always busy. Even relatives rarely asked if I wanted to join family outings unless children were involved. They weren't excluding me to be unkind. They genuinely believed I already had plans. Plans that apparently revolved around babysitting. I never told anyone that. I finally whispered. "I know." Mike sounded genuinely upset. "I didn't think much about it back then. I figured maybe you'd said something to Daniel. But after hearing about this weekend, I started wondering." I thanked him for telling me. After hanging up, I walked through my house without any real destination. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful, heavy. For nearly 3 years, I'd believed I was simply helping my son's family. I hadn't realized he was quietly building an entirely different story around my life. One where I was lonely, one where I had nothing else to do, one where spending every weekend raising his children wasn't a sacrifice. It was supposedly a favor to me. The thought hurt more than I wanted to admit. Not because strangers believed it, because my own son had created it. A few days later, Carol invited me to lunch again. This time, instead of talking about flowers or retirement, I told her everything. The grocery store conversation, Mike's phone call, the canceled plans, Daniel showing up at my house. After I'd already said no, she listened carefully before saying something simple. "Linda, when was the last time Daniel asked how you were?" I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Honestly, couldn't remember. Every conversation centered around schedules, the children pickup times, drop-off times, homework, dinner. Not once had he asked about my book club, my doctor's appointment, the community choir I'd joined 6 months earlier, or whether I was happy. Carol reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You've spent so long being available that they forgot you're a person outside of being grandma." That sentence stayed with me all afternoon. The following Saturday was strangely quiet. No little feet running through the hallway, no cartoons playing in the living room. No soccer practice, no backpacks. By the front door, I missed my grandchildren deeply, but I also noticed something unexpected. I finished an entire novel before lunch. I took a long walk around the lake. I came home and planted the lavender I'd bought at the flower festival. For the first time in months, the day belonged entirely to me. That evening, my phone rang. It was Ethan. "Hi, Grandma." His cheerful voice immediately made me smile. "Hi, sweetheart. I wanted to tell you I scored 2 goals today." "You did? That's wonderful." We talked for nearly 15 minutes. About soccer, school, his science project. Then, just before hanging up, he asked something that caught me off guard. "Are you mad at Dad?" Children have a way of asking the questions adults avoid. "No." "Then why didn't you come today?" "I had plans last weekend." "I know." He lowered his voice. "Dad said you're trying to prove a point." I closed my eyes. "I love you very much, Ethan." "I know. I also love spending time with you." "I know that too." His little voice became quieter. "I miss Grandma Saturdays." "So do I." After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone. I wasn't upset with Ethan. He was simply repeating what he'd heard, but hearing my own actions explained to him that way broke my heart. Wasn't trying to prove a point. I was trying to remember that my life mattered too. The next week, Rachel surprised me by asking if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. Part of me hoped she'd noticed how unhealthy things had become. When she arrived, she looked nervous. After a few minutes of small talk, she finally got to the reason she'd asked me there. "Daniel's been stressed, I can imagine." She nodded. "The kids miss seeing you every weekend." "I miss them too." Another silence settled between us. Then Rachel said something I wasn't expecting. "He thinks you've been pulling away." I looked at her calmly. "I've watched the children almost every Saturday for nearly 3 years. No, I've canceled birthdays, trips, lunches, concerts, and vacations." She looked down at her coffee. "I know. I've never complained." "You haven't. So how exactly am I the one pulling away?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly stirred her coffee. Finally, she sighed. "I don't think Daniel realizes how much you've given up." For the first time in a long while, I believed she was being honest. "I don't think he does either." Rachel looked at me carefully. "He talks about you like you're happiest when you're with the kids." "I am happy with them. But that's different? Very different." She nodded slowly. "I've tried telling him that." Those words surprised me. "You have? A few times?" "What did he say?" Rachel looked uncomfortable. "He said retirement is different for you because you need a purpose." I couldn't help smiling sadly. I had a purpose long before I became free childcare. Rachel winced. "I know." We sat quietly for a while. Then she admitted something that changed how I viewed her. I think somewhere along the way, we both stopped asking. We just assumed. I appreciated her honesty. Assumptions were easier to fix than cruelty, but they still caused damage. As we stood to leave, Rachel stopped beside the cafe door. "I think you and Daniel need to have a real conversation." "I think so too." That conversation happened sooner than either of us expected, because 2 evenings later, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, Daniel was standing on my porch, alone. He wasn't carrying the children's backpacks. He wasn't asking me to babysit. He looked tired. Older than I remembered. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said something I never expected to hear. "Mom, Uncle Mike called me." I stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in." As he walked into the house, I realized this wasn't going to be another conversation about childcare. For the first time in years, we were finally going to talk about us.